across a quote from LRH early in my studies that was kind of a head scratcher for me. Anyway, it said, "It is in total controversy to some of the most cherished beliefs of man, but may I point out to you quickly that man is not an entirely sane person, and thus some of his beliefs must be somewhat aberrated. There is such a thing as courage, but there is not such a thing as sanity totally opposed." That's from Dynamics 55, and I remember reading that, and I was thinking, well, I kind of get that. No, I don't.
You mean that last sentence? Last sentence, you haven't rebutted that.
There is such a thing as courage, but there is not such a thing as sanity totally opposed.
Yeah, that part right there.
Yeah, exactly. So, anyway, it took me a while. I started auditing the L's about 5 years ago, and so far I've done probably about 4,000 hours of L's, and I've had a lot of interesting insights into this from auditing people and seeing how some of these things play out, and also just observing the environment. You know, when you're studying a subject, you start to see it more and more in the environment, and I just started seeing more and more things having to do with it. I mean, LRH talks about GPMs as being the basic of any case, and all pervasive. In fact, in one place he says the GPMs are essentially the physical universe, but it's also case. So it's a little bit, it's so pervasive in a way nobody sees them. They're like the air that nobody sees, you know, or the fish that swim in the water that they're never aware of. So a GPM is a goal problem mass, and then that identity being located and having its energies going out in a certain direction because it is located will be involved in a game where there's energies from opposing identities. And over time, a being will become the thing that he opposed originally, or will originally oppose the thing that he was to begin with. And this goes back and forth, and this is like the basic of cases. It's kind of like it's a lock on problems. It's a lock on games. All games, all GPMs are games, but not all games are GPMs. GPM is the senior idea, but how do you really tell the difference between if somebody's playing a game or they're just dramatizing an identity that's part of a GPM? And that's pretty interesting. The way you can see this playing out in the area of politics, and one of the in watching a lot of this, in the last several years, one of the interesting things that I realized about politics is that what you've really got struggle over the composition of a game, because any game is a balance between freedoms, purposes, and barriers. So the political spectrum really is the spectrum between those who want all freedoms and no barriers, and those who want all barriers and no freedoms. The ideal scene with regard to any game or any society is that the barriers are acceptable rules, the freedoms are acceptable, and the purposes are worthwhile. So on one side of the spectrum you have the totalitarian people who basically want all rules and no freedom, and don't care whether they're acceptable rules or not. They just want them to be obeyed. And then on the other side of things, you have the anarchists. It's very interesting, because you'd think when these guys show up at the G8 meetings and things like that and throw trash cans through windows that they're protesting. They want to change the rules of the game. Fact of the matter is, they're not trying to change the rules of the game. They're trying to have no rules. That's really their ideal scene, is no rules. See, so when you do a lot of work with GPMs, you see that all of the insanity is on the extremes. Almost in any subject, the insanity is on the extremes. Because you have people in the middle. It's almost like a tone scale. You've got your emotionally conservative people, and you've got your emotionally liberal people, like cheerful and conservatism. And it's interesting that you see politicians that are high tone. They can agree with each other. They can see each other's point. They have maybe different priorities or different importances or different realities, and there's things to work out. But nevertheless, they can get along. They can see each other. They can see what each other's doing. When you go down the tone scale, you get the same things. You get the the sneaky communist and the oppressive totalitarian, the dictator. You get these different tone levels, and they're basically struggling over the composition of a game. So, people that are fairly high-toned in relationship to a game, they're looking for ways to improve the game. The liberals want to change things in a way that's going to improve the game. The conservatives don't want to let go of things that have worked in the past. And that's essentially the difference between those two tone levels. So that's why they can kind of see each other's point. When people propose radical solution that wants to change everything, they're not high tone. They're people that are proposing radical solutions, and this is coming out of who knows where. Another interesting thing is that it's an interesting point that all of the worst mass murderers of the 20th century were all trying to create a utopia. Really look at it, the communists were trying to create a societal utopia. The Pol Pot, Stalin, Hitler was trying to create an ideal society. Mao Zedong, all these guys were trying to create a utopia, so they had a big justification. Their justification was huge enough to justify huge overts. This is how somebody can, in their own mind, be doing so much good and be so evil.
That's fascinating.
It's so true.
The greatest good.
Make that a quote.
Yeah, and it's really an insanity. Because you can justify literally almost anything. You can justify, because of course, and Elrice talks about this in the antisocial personality. Very often the antisocial person thinks of himself as the only good person around. He's right and everybody's wrong. So in that sense, he can't see anybody else's point. He can't see anybody else's reality or his viewpoint. Whereas, people that are really trying to work on improving things, they're willing to accept incremental changes. They don't demand perfect solutions to things with no problems. They see where something could be better than another thing, and they work on it that way. So, progress is usually evolutionary, not revolutionary. Revolutionary progress usually comes from the extremes, and is really based on some sort of insane concept of what they think an ideal situation would be. So courage comes into it. There is such a thing as courage. Courage is persistence. When you're going up against your own fears, or you're going up against entrenched interests that aren't necessarily pro-survival, it takes some courage, it takes some persistence. Even if you're just persisting against the counter efforts that are random in the environment, you still have to persist. That takes courage, so there is such a thing as courage. One of the things that you get on the extremes is a lot of hatred. The more the hatred in a viewpoint, the more there's insanity. Now you would think, well, what's wrong with hating suppression? Well, there's nothing wrong with it except suppression isn't a thing. How can you hate something that isn't a thing? What people are really saying is that they hate a representative identity. The identity that represents suppression, because you can't fight suppression. You can only fight terminals. See, that locks you right into the GPM. It's like what John said earlier. You have to be. You can be informed about things. You can see things the way they are. But the minute you start to oppose them, you start walking right down that road into dramatizing an oppositional stance to something that just locks you into it, just like a tar baby. You remember the Uncle Remus story where he puts up the tar baby and he punches it, and the more he punches it, the more he gets stuck to it. Right. Well, that's what a GPM is, because there's so much charge in it, and it's so entangled in you know, because what you're ending up fighting to is, of course, some of which is your own past identity. So in a way, you're fighting yourself. But in any case, it just really sticks you to it, and it makes much more sense to stay exterior to things and persist in creating an ideal scene for yourself and others. And that's another thing about things that tend to be more GPM based, is they tend to be more, because an identity is an individual. An identity is only one dynamic. So an identity only has one goal, and it's very self-oriented. It's a self-ish goal. And of course, it's very easy to have opposition to that because, again, you're focused, you're located. And when people go into hatred, they also compact themselves into a solid ball of energy, because that's the best way to thrust forward against something like that. But see, that's the energy in a GPM. It's thrusting opposition. So when you become focused and you become and you involve yourself in like some kind of hatred of something else, then you're really just dramatizing a GPM, and of course you start to get sick physically, because it's a PTS condition as well. But it's sometimes it's hard to see it that way because because you think you're right.
You know you're right.
There's somebody was on TV and about negotiation, and he said something I thought was very insightful, and it led to a whole bunch of cognitions. He says the first rule of negotiation is you don't demonize your opponent.
Yeah, that's right.
And I go, yeah, that's true, but why is that true? Well, because what are you doing then? You're giving them a hateful identity. So of course they're going to hate you. And the one thing, when it gets really extreme, of course, the only solution to your opponent is to kill them, annihilate them, wipe them out, destroy them completely. And there is no negotiation with that. You cannot negotiate with somebody who wants to kill you. There's no compromise on that. They're going to half kill you. That's a compromise. They're going to half kill you. So what gets people out of games condition is, Ellery talks about the power of admiration. If you can grant beingness to somebody that you're working with, if you can admire them, if you want to free them, if you have the intention to free them, they won't oppose you. It's an interesting point that when you have somebody else's best interest at heart, no matter what their viewpoint is, it's very difficult for them to oppose you. It's very difficult to oppose somebody who likes you, isn't it? I mean, yes. So there is such a thing as courage, but there is no such thing as sanity totally opposed. So these are the little clues that people have as far as what are their own, what's their own GPM case about. It's like, well, what does somebody hate? What are the things they hate? Well, people will tell you that. But it isn't necessarily what they think. It's the identity that represents that. They hate this or that, and But it is. But you have to pull the string on it because it isn't necessarily obvious. And of course, it goes back a long way. And people play these games for long periods of time. I mean, just take the war GPM. There's tons of ways to play the war GPM, and it's been going on forever. And as valid as any of this information is about who causes wars, my question is always, well, okay, so who caused wars before the Rothschilds? Who caused wars before Egypt? In 5,000 years of recorded history on this planet, there have been 15,000 documented wars. So who caused all those wars before there were armament companies or the chariot makers? Were the chariot makers caused wars?
Same guys.
It's a psychiatrist.
Yeah, psychiatrist. Something else interesting as far as how this relates to Scientology. Back in '64, LRH in the bulletin, he talks about people who hate Scientology. I found this to be extremely useful over the years in understanding people. But people who hate Scientology conceive that Scientology opposes their goals. And it immediately tells you that there's a lot of different reasons why people could hate Scientology. A person might want to dramatize, for example, a drug dramatization, and Scientology stops them. So they hate Scientology because Scientology is restricting their freedom. They might, in recent years, it seems like the polarity of Scientology has shifted from wanting to free people to wanting to control and trap people. You can, if you look at Miscavige, one of the ways of understanding Miscavige is he doesn't trust anybody. He doesn't trust PCs, for sure. He doesn't trust auditors. He doesn't trust his staff members. He doesn't trust anybody. See, so he has to control everything. And that's just the opposite of wanting to free people. Because in order to free people, you have to trust that they're not going to come and come at you. You know what I mean? You're not going to free people if you feel that people are bad or evil. You just won't do it.
Right.
If you don't trust them, and he doesn't. I'm sure this was never consciously looked at, but nevertheless, that's the way it plays out. So, and also in the same bulletin he says that we got this group together basically to free people of implants, the effects of implants that they've experienced in their tract. He says, but when you treat people roughly, they start to identify you with the implanters, and then they hate you. But again, that's just the GPMs. Those are the GPMs. They hate you because you oppose their goals. Sometimes you can hate something you just think opposes your goals. It doesn't really. They don't really oppose your goals. But it's also interesting to me that having done tons of admin scales, everybody's basic goals are not in conflict with anybody else's basic goals. If everybody were operating on their basic goals, then nobody really would be in conflict with anybody. You would be doing what you wanted to do, and you would be exchanging with other people that were doing what they wanted to do, and then everybody would kind of like go back and forth, and in that way you'd have a society. Society being just a group of people who live together, work together, and are organized in a certain way. You'd have a society that everybody would be happy in.
You make it sound so simple.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the most part.
Well, it's like auditing the L's. it's simple once you get there. There's a lot of complexity on the way. But trust, lack of trust, that's just simply an indicator of what your GPM case is. You know, who you consider to be your allies. Well, you withhold things from people that are, you know, rivals or opponents. You don't tell them things. You don't tell. That's why if you have an unsafe environment, you should never have an unsafe environment when you're sex checking somebody, because they won't tell you. Even if they want to, they really don't want to. Because you're an opponent. You don't have their best interests at heart, and you don't reveal things to an opponent that they may use to hurt you. You only reveal things to a team member that needs to know things in order to work as a team with you. But see, that also tells you who considers you to be a team member, who considers you to be an opponent or a rival. And then, of course, you gets mixed up too, because in some level you're the rival, and in some level you're a teammate, and so you can start to see these things about yourself. You know, who you trust, who you don't trust, who you share data with, and who you take data, you know, keep data from. So the way out really is becoming bigger. You know, to span your activities to include more dynamics. That way you're not so focused. You aren't a target, and you aren't targeting others. You're diffuse as a being. Your space is bigger. You're not like that. Somebody was this other interesting insight about ego, because ego was always a head scratcher to me. I had a PC who was always talking about wanting to get rid of his ego. You know, okay. Where is it? and you know, and the closest I came was, well, maybe it's a surfact or something like that. Well, I mean, it's a term from another subject, you know, psychoanalysis. But somebody the other day said that ego was really self-importance.
That's right.
And then I thought, okay, and then it clicked in with me. Well, what's the other side of self-importance is self-unimportance. See, there's a GPM right there. I'm important, I'm unimportant. So you'd almost have to run out the unimportance of an individual before he'll let go of the importance, his importance. You want to let go of your ego, you run out your lack of ego. You know, your insignificance. Because having an ego is a solution to no significance. Anyway, so what I noticed in auditing these L's out is that people kind of drop a lot of their old animosities, their hatreds, their dislikes, their protests, their objections. Old games conditions surface and get blown. I mean, when Elrich is talking about games, he says, well, there's always the game you know you're playing, and then there's the game you don't know you're playing. Because any of the games that you started, like one of the definitions of games is any game is continuing by definition, since an unstarted game isn't a game and a finished game isn't a game. But once you've started a game, if you've exited that game in a way that simply has abandoned responsibility for that game, you never have turned off your creative of that game. You've only turned off your control of that game. So that game is there to react against you when it gets re-stimulated. These are old games conditions. The OW tech, or it says, will take some of the charge out of those things, but they don't really get to what's the game, what are the terminals, what are the goals involved in those games. They just get the overts off, and that calms it down. But if you start to lean on overt all the time, you're really just stimulating those GPMs, because you're not getting the whole rest of it. You're not getting the surf acts off. You're not getting the, you're not getting the actual goals. You don't know what the game is really. So this is the other way of figuring it out. It's okay, like what are my patterns of restimulation? You know, but because you find that all these old hot areas of case, you know, just kind of, they just blow. And the end product of it is people feel calmer, they feel more peaceful, more at ease. It's a lot harder to get riled up about stuff. You know, it's a lot harder to join somebody else's jihad, really. It just becomes very difficult. So you end up more focused on your own goals for yourself, your dynamics. You're less likely to get sucked into the games that other people want you to play. I mean, you know, people will provoke you. Well, why do they do that? They're trying to get you to take the other side of that game. Well, they don't know what the game is, and neither do you, but now you're playing it. You're arguing with them, or you're doing something like that, you know, struggling. You're in a kind of a conflict, and, you know, and then you look and say, well, what are we fighting about? Well, it's an overstimulation. So, you know, so getting there takes some courage, it takes some persistence. But in the end, it's well worth doing, you know, because it's really the woof and warp of case. And like Elroy says, there is such a thing as courage, but there is no such thing as sanity, totally opposed. Thank you.